Well, just a brief word from the publisher. So I'm Jason Prevost, the senior acquisitions editor, and I work closely with Jeremy and Susie on the journal and certain strategic directions. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us to celebrate our authors in the International Journal of Social Imaginaries. And well, with that warm welcome, I yield the floor, and let's hear from our discussants.
All right. So again, welcome everyone to our second installment of the Media Authors event. And of course, thank you very much, Jason and Katie for helping organizing this wonderful event. I'm Kyu Hui, assistant editor of the International Journal of Social Imaginaries, and I will be chairing today's event. And as you probably know, the topic for today's webinar is Post-Kantian imagination in Kyoto School philosophy, Miki Kiyoshi and Nishitani Keiji. And it is our great honor, actually, to have three pioneering researchers here today to share with us their most recent research on this topic. Maybe let me first introduce our three speakers before giving the floor to the speakers and presenting their own works. So first of all, we have Professor John Krummel, Associate Professor in Religious Studies, Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He is the author of Nishita Kitaro Chiasmatic Chorology, Plays of Dialectic of Plays, published by Indiana University Press. He has also written numerous essays on Heidegger, Nishida, Kyoto School, phenomenology, and Buddhist philosophy. He has translated important works from Japanese and German, including Miki Kiyoshi's The Logic of Imagination, published by Bloomsbury, and Place and Dialectic, two essays by Nishida Kitaro, published by Oxford University Press. He has edited Contemporary Japanese Philosophy, a reader, and besides serving as an editor of our journal, he is also the assistant editor of the Journal of Japanese Philosophy, as well as being the president of International Association of Japanese Philosophy. And then we have the next speaker, Professor Raquel Buso, associate professor at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. She has translated works by Nishitani Keiji, Ueda Shizutelu, and Toshihiko Izutsu into Spanish, as well as other important texts in Japanese philosophy. Alongside her many articles, she is the author of El Zen, published in Catalan first in 2008 and then in Spanish again in 2012, and co-editor of several important volumes, including Cross Currents and Confluences, La Filosofía Japonesa on sus textos, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, published in 2016, as well as Tetsukaku Companion to Ueda Shizutelu, published in 2022. Professor Buso is the president of the European Network of Japanese Philosophy and a partner researcher of the Mushinen Intercultural Philosophy Research Group. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jody Heap, Honorary Fellow of the School of Culture and Communication, University of Melbourne in Australia. He is author of The Creative Imagination, Indeterminacy and Embodiment in the Writings of Kant, Fichte, and Castoriadis, and published by Women at Littlefield in our Social Imaginary series. She is the author of numerous essays on the imagination in Kant, Fichte, Coleridge, and Castoriadis. She also has written on Mary Hesse on the role of the imagination in the philosophy and practice of science, as well as on the association between imagination, creativity, and well-being. So thank you very much for the three authors. And now, so here is the flow of today's event. So first of all, we will have John. You will have 10 to 15 minutes to present and share with us your research. And then we will move on to Raquel, and you also have 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll move on to Jody to give us a response to the two authors, followed by John and Raquel. Both we can briefly respond to Jody's comments. And then the section will be concluded with a Q&A section, which lasts approximately for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how we proceed. All right, so without further ado, John, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Caillou, for chairing the session, and I also want to thank the publisher, Brill, and Jason and Katie for organizing this session, and also thank you to Raquel and Jody for being here. So I'll give you a short summary of my paper that was published in the journal. So this is it's an explication of Miki Kiyoshi's philosophy of the imagination, which he called the logic of the imagination and the logic of forms, which I interpret as an ontology. He didn't really explicitly talk about this as an ontology, but I think it's implicit. The imagination is a concept he takes from Kant, but he's extending it beyond the confines that Kant gave it. So for Miki, the imagination has a productive function, which is embodied. It involves the body. It's technological in relation to the environment. It forms the world through our embodied praxis. And he calls that praxis inactive intuition, which is a term he borrowed from his teacher, Nishida Kitaro. Nishida was the founder of this so-called Kyoto school. Miki belongs to the second generation of the Kyoto school. And so the productivity of the imagination is also historical, because the world unfolds accordingly, through in time and space, and the imagination is involved in this. And he also calls this the logic of forms, because the imagination produces forms, and there's always an aspect of formlessness that allows for novelty and change. So the world is changing through history, transforming from form to form to form. But also Miki, interestingly, he also spent time with Heidegger in Germany. He studied abroad in Germany with Heidegger in the early 20s. This is before being in time, but he was influenced by Heidegger's reading of Kant as well. And so you could, he for example, he uses the word being in the world, or the phrase being in the world. But for Miki, being in the world is explicitly much more so than in Heidegger. Even though it was implicit in Heidegger, it involves our embodied negotiations with the environing world. So I talk about that in my paper. Also, I should mention that with Miki, the imagination is really extends beyond simply being a faculty of the mind, faculty of the individual knowing subject, as it was in Kant, but it really becomes something that involves the social collective informing the world. So this is where Miki sort of anticipates later thinkers who talk about the social imagination or social imaginary, like Ricoeur or Castoriadis, I think. And also, interestingly, he extends the imagination beyond simply human, it being a human faculty, but also into the pre-conscious depths of biological nature, because he talks about life, or actually he talks about nature, by which he means biological nature in general, as involving the imagination, because life is always changing its environment, forming forms in the environment. This might be the most controversial part of Miki's philosophy, I think. So he extends the imagination beyond its cognitive role he looks at the schematism in Kant, and also broadens the meaning of the schematism beyond its simply cognitive role or aesthetic role. He's aware of the German meaning of the word Einbildung, so he talks about that. Right, in German, Bildung is formation, so that's why he's talking about forms. Also, the word Bild, the German word Bild, means image, but also means forms, and this goes back also to the Greek concepts of eidos and idea, which can mean form or image too. So he's influenced by the German. He looks at the German and expands, or he takes what's implicit in the German in Kant and expands it upon it. So I talk about that in my paper. Also, I should mention that, as a lot of you probably know, the imagination in Kant is involved in the synthesis of receptivity and spontaneity. And so Miki interprets this in terms of what he calls pathos and logos. So it's the synthesis of pathos and logos, the imagination synthesis of pathos and logos that results in the concrete formation of the world around us, right? Which is not just cognitive, but it's the social world, the environing world that we're creating in this embodied activity. This also involves meaningfulness or sense, Sinn, and this assumes Gemeinsinn, common sense, which Kant talked about in the third critique. So Miki also refers to the third critique, which was neglected by Heidegger, because Heidegger just focused on the first critique. So in all of these senses, I talk about the imagination as being ontological. It's forming our being, and our being in the world, and the being of the world, being in the world and being of the world. And it's also social and historical. Let's see, what else do I talk about? I also so I make connections with possible connections with later thinkers. Anticipate what Miki anticipated with his concept of the imagination, but also among contemporaries, there's Ernst Cassirer. Other commentators have made more of a point about this, like Saulius Genusis and Stephen Lofts. They've written about the connection of Ernst Cassirer with Miki. Miki does refer to Ernst Cassirer, and there is a resemblance between Ernst Cassirer's theory of forms with Miki's logic of imagination. So there's probably an influence there too. And I also look into possible connections or implications of Miki's theory to what comes after Miki. Miki died right at the end of the war in 1945. He died in prison. And so it's hard to say if he knew about the atom bomb, because that he died right after the end of the war. He was in prison and he was already dying, as the war was ending. So he might have not been aware of what happened, but it's interesting to speculate about the what he might have, if he had survived the war. What would his thoughts on technology have been? Technology is a very important aspect that he spends a lot of time in his book talking about. And I also should mention that my paper is mainly on his book, The Logic of Imagination, which was his last book that he wasn't able to finish because he died at a young age in prison. But and also he wasn't, this is also before Heidegger's question of technology and Heidegger's comments on technology, right? It comes a little bit later. So it would have, so Miki really wasn't in a position to be aware of the inherent dangers of technology. He didn't really talk about it, but it's interesting to speculate about this. What would he have thought, especially today, not just beyond the nuclear dangers, but also today with the digitization of knowledge and information and reality, and the virtualization of reality, which also, since Miki was interested in the body, you can speculate about the implications for his notion of the body and of nature, especially now with AI, the current AI fear, the fear of AI. What would he have thought about that? So I kind of talk a little bit about that, speculating about potential implications. And people today talk about transhumanism or post-humanism. So I raise those issues as questions in relation to Miki's philosophy. Let's see. How do I have more time or? Okay. Also, I should mention that his theory on nature is very interesting, which I talk about in my paper. There's a kind of a continuity between human history and natural history. And as I mentioned earlier, by nature, he mainly means life or biological life, including non-human life. And he ascribes, like I said earlier, he ascribes the imagination to non-human life as well, to the extent that life in general is always negotiating with its environment and making forms, recreating its environment. So, to that extent, life in general is technological and involves the imagination. Which is a very interesting way of talking about the imagination. It's not just something that belongs to the human mind, but something that's a part of life in general. And yeah, that's something that I don't think he was able to really completely work out, because he didn't live long enough to really give his book a proper ending, a proper conclusion. But this is an interesting theory. He says that human life and natural life are united in that both involve transformation, the formation of forms, the ongoing formation of forms. And this is an ongoing process of the world forming itself. So in that sense, our formation of the world is a part of the world's forming itself. We're participants in the world's self-forming. This is also an idea he gets from his teacher, Nishida, I think. And so this involves nature as well, natural non-human life forming itself. We're part of this process. So even our technology is simply a completion of the technology of nature. Here he refers to Kant in the third critique. Kant talks about the technology of nature, or organic technology, organische Technik. So, he kind of appropriates that idea to talk about nature itself as forming the world in its own way and he calls that technology, and he says the imagination is behind it, nature's imagination. And again, here one can speculate about what the implications would be for more recent ways of understanding the human and body and nature and technology, with the more recent interfacing of human and technology and machine and virtual reality, and the digitization of our environment. What are the implications? So I mentioned more recent thinkers like Bernard Stiegler, who talks about the formation of the techno culture, I think, if I remember. I think it was technoculture he called it. That transcends just ethnic or geographic orders. And I mentioned Don Eide, who talked about how our being in the world cannot be separated from technology. Catherine Hales, who talks about the union of organic and machine technology. So I speculate a little bit about that, in relation to Miki. So it's really unfortunate that Miki died at a young age. He was only in his 40s when he died. And it's also ironic, he died right after the war ended, but he was still in prison because everything was chaotic, right after the war ended. And so the new government, they hadn't yet released the old political prisoners who were in prison from the previous regimes. And then he, because of the bad prison conditions, he died due to unhygienic conditions. So it was unfortunate. Let's see what else. Yeah, so there's a lot in Miki, I think, that one can take out of his work and try to develop it further today. And that's kind of what I was trying to point towards, to sort of open up possible questions that we could ask of him, and we might also be able to use his ideas to ask about what we're facing today. Yeah, so that's what I tried to do.
Thank you very much, John, for this concise summary of your really incredibly rich paper. And next, we have Professor Raquel Busso to share with us her work on the topic. So Raquel, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. I would like just to add that I'm not anymore the president of INOGP since in September. We have got a new president elected, Alex Mustadea, but that's the only thing I would like to correct about your really kind introduction. And of course, I would like to begin by extending my gratitude to the editors of the journal, this wonderful Social Imaginaries journal, and Brill, the publishers. Thank you for providing me with this invaluable opportunity to engage in this webinar and to further explore the questions surrounding the topic of imagination with this particular focus on Kyoto School. I'm also grateful for the chance to present my approach to this topic in dialogue with John Krummel, whose insightful work on Miki Kiyoshi is a really valuable contribution to this topic. In my article on Nishitani, I do not focus on Nishitani's reception of Kant. At the time when I was writing this article, I have not yet read John Krummel's work on Miki, and therefore these two texts cannot be easily read in parallel. However, We both have the opportunity to participate together in a panel discussion, well, even with Jody as well, with Jody Heap. We participate in a panel discussion at the World Philosophy Congress in Rome last August. And during that occasion, in spite of the numerous connections that can be established between Nishitani's work and Miki's on imagination, I also did not address the role of imagination in Nishitani's work in relation to Miki's, but instead I sought to contextualize it from within the framework of post-Kantian perspectives on the productive imagination. So therefore, my hope is now this event will provide an opportunity for further discussion or reflection and learning more on the subject. So what was the principal focus of my article? Well, you maybe, or you, the audience probably know that Nishitani, like Miki, is considered a second generation philosopher in this Kyoto school. He lived longer than Miki because he was born in 1900 and he died in 1990. So he lived almost the whole 20th century. And he was also a student of or disciple of Nishida. In a previous article I wrote related with imagination, I examined the question of representation and the role of images in Nishitani's thought in the light of the German mystic Meister Eckhart notion of Entbildung, or disimagination. This disimagination itself is a sort of reinterpretation of the processes of negation and abstraction in Neoplatonic thought. So a pivotal concept in Nishitani's philosophy is that of emptiness, in Japanese, ku. In my interpretation, then, this notion of emptiness can be better understood not as a mere philosophical concept, but as a sort of method of elucidating a process of negation and detachment, of separation. The intent in that previous work I wrote was to show in a way that this process of self-emptying, or the dynamic process of emptiness, in a sense is analogous to, or even it can be said is a reinterpretation of Eckhart Entbildung. This process can be reinterpreted in epistemological terms as a continuous critical process aimed at an understanding of our logical and linguistic limitations of apprehending reality. It can be also read or interpreted in an ontological way as a process of desubstantialization, namely a processual understanding of reality that stands in contrast to the essentialization and reification of being. From an ethical and religious perspective, it can also be understood as a process of detachment or abandonment of egocentrism, self-centeredness, which aligns with Buddhist teachings and Christian teachings as well to some extent. That is to say that emptiness entails this kind of process of self-negation or disidentification with the ego, or it can be put in other terms as an expansion of the self through the comprehension of one's identity as a construct that extends beyond the boundaries of the ego. In all these cases, the epistemological, the ontological, the ethico-religious perspectives, the function of emptiness is to act as a dynamic negation, thus avoiding the fixation and crystallization of beliefs into dogmas in terms of religion, or the transformation of images into idols, so to speak. Is always a sort of deconstruction in a sense. However, it is not merely a matter of negation. In Nishitani's philosophy, as well in Buddhist tradition, at least part of it, in Mahayana tradition mainly, the concept of emptiness, or the notion, if we don't want to speak of concept in that context, acquires a positive sense that allows for affirmation even if it is from a contingent or provisional perspective. This is important, of course, because Nishitani's philosophy is open to his variety of interpretations, including those that draw political or social conclusions from his arguments. But as a philosopher with a primary interest in religion, particularly in mystical thought, in Western mysticism and in Zen Buddhism, and existential interpretation is arguably the most straightforward or the most evident. In my interpretation of Nishitani's philosophy and this pivotal concept of emptiness, Nishitani responds to the problem of modern nihilism, that is the end of metaphysics or the secularization of society, and what this process entails. I mean, the absence of a teleology or meaning in history and in the individual life within this framework of history. And Nishitani responds to that problem of nihilism by recovering this Buddhist notion of shunyata in Sanskrit. So in this context, that is very briefly his main contribution, could be said, to the problem of nihilism or the core of his religious thought. Within this context, it's possible to understand his interest in what would be, above all in his major philosophy, the last stage of his philosophical production, is the returning of the notion of emptiness, but now focusing in imagination, in affection or sentiment, in poetry, in myths. So Nishitani devoted the last part of his career to try to thinking emptiness in affect, emptiness crystallized, so to speak, in poetry and in religious teachings, in myths, and so on. Then the focus on my article, this article published in the Social Imaginaries journal, the aim was to present or to explore these aspects, why Nishitani relates this notion of emptiness to imagination. And as some scholars have observed, before I address this issue, other scholars explicitly mentioned that Nishitani draws on Aristotle, and explicitly Nishitani mentions Aristotle's concept of koine asthesis or sensus communis when he's discussing about elementary imagination. Moreover, also some scholars previously have indicated that in his theory of imagination, Nishitani is indebted to Buddhist thought. So in light of these two considerations, Aristotle's influence and Buddhist influence, and the fact that Nishitani himself makes reference to Mr. Eckhart theology of image in Christian tradition, with examples that he drew from artistic and religious imaginary from these two traditions, Buddhist and Christian. So my approach, taking into consideration all of this, begins with somewhat genealogical, very briefly, but a kind of genealogical understanding of imagination in Greek, Christian, and Buddhist tradition, trying to underline the aspects that I think Nishitani takes in his theoretical approach to imagination. While it can be argued that it was not certainly until Kant that the positive role of productive imagination was came to the fore, and that is productive imagination as not merely representative or represent the productive imagination. Nevertheless, it is interesting to observe the manner in which the discussion has mainly developed within the context of Western philosophical tradition. Because I quote in my article François Julien, the philosopher and sinologist, who says that in the Chinese tradition, classical Chinese, and it can be considered also Japanese tradition part of this legacy as a East Asian classical thought, Julien says that imagination was discredited in Western philosophy because the dependency on the body and sensation, and this Western interpretation or neglection of imagination also was adopted in modern China, where in a context when the tradition or the classical tradition was not at all focused on the issue of imagination in these terms. I mean, body or sensation was not a matter of criticism to develop interest in this sort of productive imagination, even if Saint Julien says that imagination as something related with fiction was not a central concern in classic Chinese philosophy. In any case, I wanted to explore all these sources from Aristotle's Fantasia to the critique of images in the notion of eikasia, for example, in Plato, the developments in later Christian Neoplatonism, and all these traditions or approaches to image and imagination. It is clear for me that oscillate between being and non-being of the images, ontologically speaking. In gnosiological or epistemological terms, images are granted to a certain extent of a cognitive value, albeit inferior to that of logos. On the one hand, therefore, there is the question of the ontophany of images, that is the relationship between appearance and reality. And on the other, there is the question of the relationship between the image and the concept, which can be further analyzed in terms of its variants, such feeling and reason, or subjective and objective. In the context of Asian philosophical traditions, a variety of perspectives as well can be observed. However, an examination of this dichotomy, appearance and reality, or feeling and reason, in Miki Kiyoshi's terms, would be pathos and logos. No? It's always these two poles. And this reveals a tendency in the Taoist and Buddhist traditions, which both exerted huge influence on Zen Buddhism, mainly the main tradition that has an influence upon Nishitani thought. So this tendency is in these Taoist Buddhist traditions and Zen Buddhism. The tendency is to privilege the non-duality between the two, or in other terms, the oscillation or the polarization, even the interchangeability, depending on the context within these two. So it's not a binary, mutual exclusive relation. So it's interesting for me that in traditional Chinese and Japanese artistic theories, this distinction between reality and the ideal, or the sensibility and intellectual understanding, is not such a binary opposition. Nonetheless, is a dynamic, dialectical alternation of emptiness and fullness. So these two terms seem to be more appealing or more crucial in these discussions, as in Nishitani's philosophy. Emptiness and fullness plays a foundational role instead of this dichotomy between reality and ideal, or sensibility and understanding, intellectually speaking. And my article, I quote one of the authors or the scholars is now in the audience, Marcello Ghilardi. I quote him when he says that in these artistic Chinese theories, classical theories, every image is alive and contributes to the global flowing of the vital energy that permeates every single aspect of reality. That is the concept of emptiness in these Chinese and Japanese artistic theories is intimately connected with the idea of vital breath, so key energy, qi in Chinese, and the principle of alternation between yin and yang. It is the primary site of transformation, where fullness can reach its full potential. So here there is an introduction of discontinuity and reversibility in the work of art that we can see in classic images, especially in Subokuga or Zen traditional artistic practices, which permits the elements that comprise it to transcend limitations of rigid opposition or even the unilateral development. So it is precisely in the artistic world where we can see the encounter between subjectivity and exteriority, making this splitting disappear and creating instead a relationship of open reciprocity between the subject and the objective world. Thus, the image is not a sensitive figuration serving as a representation of the intelligible, but the place where the objective and subjective spheres communicate. What is essential is the intimate resonance that is produced. So in his analysis, Nishitani draws upon these traditions as evincing his notions of emptiness in affects or even the notion of the transparency of being. Nevertheless, his discussion is situated within a broader context of engagement with Western philosophical traditions, encompassing thinkers such as I said, Aristotle or Descartes, but Kant, Bergson, Sartre, and Heidegger. Nishitani primarily discusses the concepts of impermanence expressed in the arts of painting and poetry, for example. Then he posits the expression of impermanence as something that can be understood not only in negative light, but in that sense of futility, of hollowness, but in a positive sense, as I mentioned before, in the sense that it can be opens the possibility of the contemplation of the void, of the emptiness, as a principle of reality. And then he introduces the idea that emptiness manifests itself in sensations, perceptions, feelings, in the moods in our everyday lives, functioning as a determining and regulating element. He gives as an example the poetry, haiku, and this poetical form that exemplifies this point because it creates a space of where interiority and exteriority or poetic subject and object are blurred, and therefore it granted a non-objectivizing knowledge. So this poetical way of showing the action of emptiness, when the poet evokes the phenomenal reality without being attached to it, or without seeking transcendence outside, but opening to that and what constitutes the realm beyond the reifying attachment of subjectivity. This that is typical of art, and Nishitani says is not only a prerogative of artists, of poets, is something that is very elemental. It is happening all the time in our everyday lives. Maybe here we can explore further this idea of everydayness and make a connection between active intuition, not Koiteki Chokan in Nishida, and the reading in Miki of this way of forming and transforming, co-creating reality with the world. This is part, perhaps, of what Nishitani also has in mind, even if he doesn't say so explicitly. He instead speaks of imagine of emptiness, like embodiment of images in poetic, artistic, and religious spheres that evoke emptiness, denoting a non-abiding or this impermanence at the level of affect. And secondly, he speaks of making being transparent. That is a process of diaphanation, making visible the real condition behind what we understand as separate or consistent appearance of things. So according to Nishitani, and this is part of the conclusion in my paper, emptiness is reflected upon and transferred to affectivity, and consequently, image evokes a quality that transcends the confines of the individual, the mere subject. Therefore, emptiness originally manifests itself not theoretically in speculation, but in affect, in sentiment, so to speak. the thing, the reality, is illuminated from inside when it's turned into image. So this is a self-disclosure of to reality through what is expressed, so to speak. So it reveals kind of transparency, because it reveals that the thing itself is always related and unhindered, is part of a relational dynamism. In this regard, imagination can be seen as the source of images, both produced as emptiness in affects and the transparency of being. It is rooted in sensibility and takes place in the body. Again, is this emphasis of late Nishida and Miki in the body, in the senses, in the earth. Is the body is immersed in the sensory world and therefore provides a basic and immediate knowledge of reality. At the same time, imagination is creative. It is this intelligible or spiritual aspect that develops in continuity with the affective dimension. So emptiness in affect grounds the functioning of an elemental kind of imagination prior to any division between mental and physical, as affects somehow constitute sensation and thought. It's already operating there. It's something more primordial. And as I mentioned before, artists have this sensitivity and manifest in their practice, in their aesthetic existence, all this elemental imagination. But this sensibility resides in the realm of perception and emerges as a knowledge, very basic, in which there is no distinction between subject and object. So it's part of, as I said before, our everyday experience when we are really in touch with the basic or elemental dimension of reality. So the discussion contained in the essay about the inseparability between feeling and sensibility and knowledge that entails it, I think help us to understand what it means to be in the fundamental side of being, according to Nishitani, in the sense of becoming transparent in elemental imagination. Because in the activity of feeling, Nishitani maintains there is always a reciprocal forgetfulness of the self and the thing. So there is a kind of loss or oblivion of the this detached perspective or way of projecting or seeing reality. And this oblivion points out the basic unity between what we usually call the subject and object of experience. In a certain sense, this can be seen also as a continuity with nature and can be in that regard perhaps related with this idea of Miki of nature as creative or imaginative, because in sensibility, original facts appear as they are. So it's Shizen, no, is nature showing, disclosing itself. And for example, Nishitani mentions that when we see a flower, when I see a flower, I forget myself and the flower appears to me as it is. So in this realm, the essence of the flower lies in the mere appearance of the flower. It's not in my idea of it, it's merely appearance. So the activity of seeing, the thing seen, and the place in which this takes place, no, it occurs, combine and form one. So therefore, seeing for Nishitani in that sense is the immediate way in which the seers themselves, and in union with sensibility, can appreciate and can have real and direct access to the real. This is a sort of self-understanding, more basic than any idea of subject, as I said. And according to him, is a kind of search for the true basis of knowledge, because therefore there can be other types of knowledge, but this is the most basic level. In other words, our everyday sensory experience hold, according to Nishitani, infinite possibilities, albeit only rarely that is only when we leave behind our usual way of perceiving, when we return to the foundation of sensitivity, that we are struck by beauty and the beauty of things that disclose themselves. And in this experience is where the elementary imagination occurs. Of course, in that sense, we enter into the realm of the artistic and religious domains, and we get deep into this experience. From this approach, I conclude in my article, just I'm finishing, that Nishitani's proposal seems to find its place between the two parallel tendencies we can determine in contemporary discussions of imagination or regarding the image, between the being and non-being of images, between the subjectification and objectification. And in line with the Sino-Japanese tradition or the Buddhist aesthetics, Nishitani recognized the full presence of the image in real sensitive appearance, as well the material and spiritual intertwining. At the same time, he recognizes this image affective, aesthetic, and noetic content as derived from its expressive capacity, its openness to meaning, an aspect that perhaps is not developed by Miki, as far as I understand, but implicitly is already there. And perhaps later we can discuss with Jody about the Post-Kantian connection in this regard, the possibility of creating meaning, that something that follows from something that can open in his discussion. So just ending with saying that emptiness in Nishitani is from which images arise and which they evoke. So it's again a matter of forming and transforming and co-creating a reality. Again, a process of imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raquel, for this really thought-provoking presentation. Next, we have Dr. Jody here to share with us her thoughts on the work of Raquel and John. So, Jody, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to John and Raquel for the invitation to respond to your articles and also to work with you once again. And also great to be back with the Social Imaginaries group, given that my first monograph was published under their series. So tonight, I thought that in light of John and Raquel's discussion on how Miki and Nishitani developed the idea of the imagination, I thought I'd explore in greater detail sort of two themes that resonated with me from their discussions, especially given my work on Kant. And the first concerns the question of how does the Kyoto school, or in this specific case, how does Miki and Nishitani's concept of the imagination take off from Kant's productive imagination? What is it about Kant's work that inspired Miki and Nishitani to develop and extend the concept of the productive imagination into new domains? And the second theme concerns the ongoing development of the idea of the productive imagination. In other words, did Miki and Nishitani anticipate later developments within the field? And how might their ideas and these developments be relevant today? And John certainly touched on that quite a lot in his article. So returning to the first theme, I thought I'd begin with Heidegger's comment in his text, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, that in his search for the unknown root of all human cognition, Kant brought the possibility of the realm of metaphysics to an abyss. And as a result, he was forced to choose between two propositions. The first was outlined in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, and it suggested that the transcendental power of the productive imagination formed the unknown root of all human cognition. And this was a proposition which defined the imagination as an indispensable and independent function of the human soul. The second, which was outlined in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, suggested the transcendental power of the productive imagination mediates between the realms of sensibility and understanding, a proposition which defined the imagination primarily as a function of the understanding. So within the context of the question of how does Miki and Nishitani's concept of the imagination take off from Kant's productive imagination, I think it'd be fair to say that these two propositions and the inherent tensions between them formed the inspiration behind their engagement with the idea of the productive imagination. And although Miki developed Kant's ontological claims and Nishitani developed Kant's epistemological claims, they did so through an intimate engagement with Kant's reflections on the schematizing power of the productive imagination. And this is a theme that I hadn't done a lot of work on the Kyoto School. And this, when I was reading both John and Raquel's articles, this was something that just sort of came out to me, this whole schematizing activity of the imagination. So Kant introduced the necessity for the act of schematism in both the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Judgment, when he was confronted with the heterogeneous nature of the realms of sensibility, understanding and reason. The observation in the first critique that understanding is incapable of intuiting something and sensibility is incapable of thinking something revealed that the capacity to think about something, or the capacity to make analytic, synthetic and reflective forms of judgment, involved for Kant a form of schematizing between these powers of the soul. Yet Kant was confronted, as he claimed, with the limits of his own critical system, because he described the act of schematism as a hidden art in the depths of the human soul. Albeit hidden, however, he did acknowledge schematism involved the power of the productive imagination, which, when residing in a form of objective or subjective play with the other mental powers of the soul, could bring together the various representational aspects of sensibility, understanding and reason, producing in the process schematic, aesthetic and symbolic forms of representations. So the imagination formed for Kant an indispensable role in giving form to all forms of human cognition. So in relation to Nishitani's concept of the imagination, it can be argued that Kant's depiction of the activity of schematism in the first and last critiques form the impetus behind his description of the imaging of emptiness. Okay, for example, the concept of the elemental imagination, which Raquel talked about in her article, was described by Nishitani as the power which transforms the primary fact of a thing into an image. And this opens on to Kant's discussion of the activity of schematism, because the image form, as Raquel has highlighted, lies in between the thing and the concept, okay, between the sensible and the intellectual. And although conceptualization has not occurred, a form of schematism has in fact taken place, enabling the production of a representation in the mind. So to understand Nishitani's claim here, it's useful to draw on Kant's description in the Critique of Pure Reason that the imagination functions to determinatively synthesize the range of impressions given through our five senses, producing in the process the form, and here he calls it as a raw and confused image, which is in need of further analysis. And the suggestion here that the image is in need of further analysis is crucial, because it highlights, as Kant later described in the Critique of Judgment, that we have the ability to apprehend the presence of an object before conceptualization has taken place. So to draw on Nishitani's example, we can apprehend the presence of a cicada before knowing that it is a specific cicada. Yet for Kant, the capacity to apprehend the presence of an object through the production of an image is also associated with pleasure or displeasure. Now, this important, often overlooked aspect of Kant's work proposes that pleasure is associated just with the mere apprehension of an object. So this pleasure is differentiated from the feeling of pleasure associated with judgments of the beautiful, for example, because it is not reflected upon. Okay, so the pleasure or displeasure merely arises as an effect of the subjective form of the apprehended cognition or image, and expresses the fact that the form of the object apprehended is commensurate with one's cognitive powers. In other words, the form of the object produced by the empirical power of the imagination is amenable to, or can at some stage objectively schematize with the rules of the understanding, enabling the determination of the image as an image of a specific cicada, for example. So for Kant, the pleasure or displeasure associated with the production of a raw and confused form of image reveals that a subjective form of schematism has in fact occurred, ensuring the image produced is something present in intuition, and it is amenable to further analysis by the understanding. So I'd like to suggest here that in his reflections on the role of the imagination in artistic and religious images, Nishitani takes up this idea of the schematizing action of the productive imagination, and in the process develops and extends the mediatory function of the productive imagination into the ontological realm. For example, the imaging of emptiness opens onto and develops Kant's idea of the act of schematism, because there is, as Nishitani has argued, the reciprocal penetration and mutual projection between differentiated things. As Nishitani is suggesting here, a form of schematism occurs, not simply between our own cognitive powers, but rather between things or between self and other. The image formed through the elemental imagination functions, therefore, not merely epistemologically in giving form to an aesthetic or symbolic representation, but ontologically in the sense that a form of sensing or feeling occurs, which allows the reciprocal forgetfulness of the self and the thing, as Raquel just talked about. Engaging with artistic or religious images is associated, therefore, with a form of schematism, evoking something in us which, and at the same time, transcends us as human beings. It evokes something more than mere pleasure or displeasure, because it renders possible the religious contemplative experience of the affect of emptiness, of the experience of the living nothingness forming the very ground of transcendence. So Kant's introduction to the necessity for the act of schematism also played an influential role in the development of Miki's conception of the imagination. And as John has also shown in his discussion, Miki devoted much of the chapter titled Experience in the Logic of Imagination to in deep engagement with this aspect of Kant's work. However, and in this instance, Miki engages with the ontological rather than the epistemological and aesthetic spheres. For example, through his discussion of the activity of schematism, Miki extends the productive dominion of the Kantian imagination in the sense that the production of form images are for Miki world-forming. Accordingly, and as John has made clear, Miki promotes an ontology of form which precedes and in fact makes possible the form of the human subject. Now, Miki's development of an ontology of form provides an important segue into the second theme I'd like to explore, the question of how does the Kyoto School anticipate later developments in European philosophy? Miki's exposition of the productive imagination as forming the root of all forms is important here because he describes the schematizing capacity of the imagination, the capacity of which resides in a form of relation between logos and pathos, as giving form to the formless, and it does so by creating something from nothing. In this regard, Miki develops Kant's description in the third critique that the imagination is the originator of chosen forms, by suggesting that the imagination gives form to that which is formless. So on the basis of these claims, it can be argued that Miki anticipates Cornelius Castoriadis's elucidation of the concept of creation, the concept of which is contextualized in specific relation to the ancient Greek notion of chaos as the void. So Castoriadis draws here on the description of the void as an initial state of formless confusion, a state which is inexhaustible and forever present. The void thus forms the abyss behind everything that exists, the conception of which promotes the view that chaos is the creative force, or chaos is the vis formandi underlying the possibility of the upsurging of forms. So for Castoriadis, therefore, all living beings embody a creative force, chaos is all living beings embody an inexhaustible potentiality that arises out of the indeterminacy of the chaos, abyss, bottomlessness of being. And yet Castriatus also promoted the view that humankind presents as an offspring of nature, because in distinction to living beings, humankind embodies an acausal vis formandi. In other words, humankind can create ex nihilo, it can create from nothing or out of nothing forms defunctionalized from biological concerns. So it can be argued, therefore, that Miki anticipates Castriatus's concept of creation as ex nihilo through his exploration of the productive imagination as the root of all forms, but also through his discussion of the technology of nature, which John talked about. For as Miki explains, human beings are rooted in nature, and yet they can create forms not found in nature. Much like Nishitani, Miki introduces the idea that humankind has the capacity to schematize with the natural world, and yet they can transcend the natural world through the capacity to create forms other than those found in nature. So given the development of the concept of the productive imagination within the Kyoto School, I'd like to end this brief discussion or response by suggesting that Miki's logic of imagination and Nishitani's imaging of emptiness have far-reaching implications, envisaging the imagination as giving form to the living nothingness or as giving form to the formless, provides the means in which we can begin to articulate and give form to one such implication, that being that we as human beings are grounded in the natural world. In the age of the Anthropocene and the devastating implications of climate change, the Kyoto School have, through their development and anticipation of the idea of the productive imagination, provided the foundation for the reunification of humankind with the natural world, the act of which demands humankind is included rather than excluded in articulations of the concept of nature. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jody. So next, John and Raquel, you can both respond to Jody's comments. Jonathan, you're muted. Can you unmute? Can you find the unmute button, John?
I see. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, it took me a while to find it. Yeah, thank you very much, Jody. I agree. I agree pretty much with everything you were saying. As a response, I could just touch on some of the points made by Jody's response. Certainly, as I mentioned, the imagination for Miki plays an ontological role. So this is an expansion beyond Kant. Also, the fact that the imagination for him involves our embodied praxis is also an expansion beyond Kant. And interestingly, when he talks about based on Heidegger's reading, when he talks about the imagination as the root of the faculties, and then he goes on to equate or at least suggest the equation of the imagination with acting intuition, or what I actually prefer the translation inactive intuition, which was John Maraudo's translation of Koitek Chokan, but acting intuition or inactive intuition concept coming from Nishida. This is also something that in Nishida, Nishida himself did not really explicitly connect acting intuition or inactive intuition with Kant's so-called hidden root of the faculties, but inactive intuition for Nishida was also something that involves the non-duality of supposed opposites, spontaneity, our activity in the world, but also our receptivity of information, sense data coming to us, right? And so for Nishida, we come to be aware of the world through our embodied activity in the world. So that's what Miki takes that idea from Nishida and then relates it to the imagination in Kant and relates it to the hidden root that Heidegger focused on in Kant. And I guess the difference from Heidegger is that for Heidegger, ultimately, this has something to do with finite temporality. For Heidegger, time was an important factor, how we relate to our own mortality. So, and that's what he develops in Being and Time, our relationship to our own coming death, and how we comport to that fact, whether we ignore it or accept it. But for Miki, it's not just about time. Obviously, it's about our ongoing negotiations with the world at large. So one could also say that it has there's a spatial aspect in Miki too. So inactive intuition implicitly is suggested to be the root of the faculties, I think, in Miki's understanding of Kant. And this also is there's a social historical nature because it's always ongoing and changing, as I've mentioned before. And so this is also how he understands the schematism in Kant, right? As not just the schematism in the first critique, which is epistemological, but then also in the third critique, where you have the schematization without concepts, where schemas occur. Instead of concepts, you have exemplary validity, examples and models, the product of genius, through our common sense, we discern a kind of an example or model in the product of genius. So the interplay between singularizing genius and universalizing taste, genius that invents and taste that institutes. This interplay for Miki is understood in terms of pathos and logos. So that relationship between the two Miki develops. And also, I should say that this interplay between the two, pathos and logos, ultimately in Miki is suggested to be the imagination's own forming of the formless, which is actually the formless forming itself. So in that sense, I think one could relate it to a suggestion made in Raquel's presentation of an idea coming from the East Asian tradition of the non-duality. The pathos and logos are not really ultimately not opposite things, but it's really the formlessness forming itself. This is also an idea that Miki takes from his teacher Nishida. And so it's another way of talking about the historical world forming itself that I mentioned earlier in Nishida's language. Or you can talk about nature, historical nature forming itself. So this comes out in the faculty of the imagination's activity of synthesis and also the activity of schematism or schematization. Um, and also this involves, as I mentioned earlier, common sense in Kant's third critique, Gemeinsinn, which the relationship between common sense and the imagination in Miki, I think, as I already mentioned, anticipates later notions of the social imaginary in people like Castoriadis and Ricoeur and Taylor and other thinkers. Also, I should talk about nothingness. Jody talked about Castoriadis's idea of creatio ex nihilo, and also Castoriadis talks about chaos coming from the ancient Greeks. And this is interesting because Miki also uses both words. He occasionally mentions the word chaos, konton, in Japanese, which was also a word. Konton comes from Chinese in Taoism, right? It's the same sinograph, meaning chaos or formlessness. But in the logic of imagination, he, for the most part, he uses the word mu, or nothingness, which he gets from Nishida, mu as the source of forms. But also we should always remember, in the Kyoto school, and I think Eastern traditions, but also I think this goes for Castoriadis too, and I think it also goes for Heidegger and other thinkers who talk about nothingness. Nothingness is never literal nothingness, right? It's never a literal nothing, but it usually with these thinkers it means formlessness, indeterminacy that allows for change and novelty. It allows forms to change from one form to another, and that's what drives history for Miki and for his teacher Nishida too, who talked about the ongoing self-forming formlessness, or formlessness forming itself. So for Miki, the imagination is taking part in this process. Human imagination is taking part in this process, which is broader than human spontaneity or human intentionality. We're a part of this process. And same with technology. That's why he talks about the technology of nature. And so our technology is involved in this process. And then this is where questions come up. The sort of questions that Jody raised about the Anthropocene and the dangers of ecological dangers inherent in certain forms of technology. So to what extent, in what sense, when human technology becomes independent or distinct from natural technology, to what extent are we still taking part in nature? Is it still a part of the process of nature or not? Those sorts of questions come up, which is not always evident, and it's something that we have to continue to think about today, especially today, decades after Miki passed, and with all the newer forms of technology, not just, I already mentioned nuclear technology, but there's the other forms of technology that's destroying the environment, and now there's all the implications of virtual reality and AI and all of that. So to what extent is this all a part of nature? Is it natural, or in what sense is it artificial? In what sense is this natural? In what sense is it positive? In what sense is it negative? Good or bad? And you have all kinds of ethical implications, political implications. So those are questions that not necessarily, these thinkers are not necessarily giving us answers, but they point us to think about these questions today, I think. And so this goes for Castoriadis too. So I think, it would be good to read people like Castoriadis together with Miki and other thinkers, and to discuss these issues. And also, I think, Jody mentioned, talked about the grounding of humans in nature. So that's also a related topic, the unification and reunification of humanity and nature. That's something we need to think about with the Anthropocene, and Miki certainly raises questions about this. He doesn't necessarily give us clear answers, but at least he will make us think about it, especially with the newer technologies that have developed after Miki. To what extent is our ongoing advancement in technology involving our bodies, body augmentation? To what extent is that natural or not? Does it deviate from the natural path of evolution and development or not? Body augmentation, but also virtual, our expansions into the virtual dimension too. To what extent is this a part of nature or not? These are questions that get raised.
And could I ask that,
Yeah.
John? Sorry to interrupt, but because Castoriadis talks about how we've become, because of humankind's acausal nature. So we're creating forms that are defunctionalized from nature, from our biological needs. So does Miki talks about us being a natural extension of nature, but does he talk about the fact that we've, like Castoriadis, that we're sort of splitting off from nature?
Well, he says that we're continuous and discontinuous with nature. There's a continuity and discontinuity. So there's a kind of a dialectic. He gets this dialectic from his teacher Nishida too. Human beings and nature is relating to each other through a dialectic of continuity and discontinuity. So he kind of leaves it ambiguous, and that's why it's, I think if he had lived longer, he would have been able to work these these issues out more clearly. I think the logic of imagination is not really a finished work. I mean, it was serialized over from 1937 to 1939, and then it was the part one was published as a book, and then part two was published after he died posthumously, but he was still planning on writing more chapters. I mean, even with the parts he completed, it's already a long book, but he was going to write more, and he wasn't able to give it a proper conclusion. So even though it's a very important work, and a lot of most Miki scholars would point to the logic of imagination as his most important work, his magnum opus. Nevertheless, it's not really a finished work, and he doesn't really work out all of these issues to a satisfactory degree. But in a sense, that ambiguity, I think, was inherited. He inherited from Nishida too, because there's the same sort of ambiguity was in Nishida, you know, with continuity and discontinuity. In one sense, human technology deviates from natural technology, but in another sense, it's an extension of it. And like I said, this leads to ethical questions, but he doesn't really work out the ethical issues. It's not really clear. So it's more up to Miki interpreters to take Miki in different ways, you know, and to try to work out the ethical issues. And you see this in different commentators of Miki. Yeah.
Right. Sorry to interrupt, but because time is running short, maybe we should see if Raka has any comments or response to Jody's thoughts before we turn briefly to the other audiences.
Yeah, well, very briefly, because I would like to hear more the audience questions or have a kind of dialogue. But thank you, Jody, for raising these interesting questions. At first, well, I totally agree with the idea of schematism that applies to Nishitani's elementary imagination, perhaps it's borrowed from Kant, in the sense that, as far as I understand, Nishitani would agree with Kant in the sense that the work of art or the aesthetic idea transcends conceptual thought and by definition, and this is why it's more adequate, perhaps, or can express what is unexpressible, no, or what is ineffable. In that sense, I think probably Nishitani would follow that idea. But what you raise is more the another aspect of Kant theory of imagination. It's the creative imagination as something that participates in all representative activities of the spirit, in the sense the perceptual schematism, or the other aspect, so to speak, the symbolic reason. On the one hand, the idea that creative imagination helps somehow to constitute the objective knowledge, even of nature, transcending it. But at the same time, Kant seems to open this possibility of using imagination to posit or analogical metaphysical thought, this symbolic reason, or theories reflecting about the absolute, for example, symbolically. So, of course, Kant introduces the image into the cognitive process, and this is, I think, Nishitani also would agree, because has also recognized this potential of imagination as this noetical potential. But this is more a question or a doubt that I have, because it seems to me that for Kant, still the logic or the conceptual aspect is hierarchically more important. And I would say in Nishitani's case, he has not placed a higher value on science or logic, but to aesthetic knowledge. And I'm not sure, John, if you would agree that you just said that for Miki, pathos and logos are with Soku, no, are Soku with this particle are non-dual, but maybe it's the case that for Miki, since he's speaking of a logic of imagination, I don't know, what is, according to your opinion, what is more valuable, the logos or pathos? After reading your article, it seemed to me that pathos seems to be more primordial or more basic for Miki. I don't know, it's more a question than that's something that came just to my mind, because in the case of, yeah, well, if you want to, yeah, please.
Sure. Well, this is it's implicit in Miki, but this is my own reading of Miki, that because pathos refers to the formlessness, and this is well, it's possible to say that, I mean, in one sense, pathos and logos are supposed to be on an equal plane, but in another sense, pathos that refers to formlessness refers to something deeper than the forms, because forms come out of formlessness, right? Forms come out of the nothingness, which is always underlying the process of ongoing transformation. So in that sense, you could say that pathos points to what's deeper and ontologically. But it's very implicit. It's only implicit in Miki, but in my article, I kind of draw that out,
Well, just something to think about more. And thank you for the comment. Also, Jody has said that, or you has mentioned this unknown root of human cognition, no? Heidegger critique to Kant, and maybe it's something that is also a question I have. Maybe this formless forming itself, or Nishitani's emptiness, can be seen as this unknown origin, because Jody, you said that in Nishitani, this formal schematism is in us and transcends us. So Nishitani's emptiness is also operating this way. Is something that is it belongs to ourselves because it's our continuum non-being, but at the same time is something that transcends us. And perhaps this is something that deserves more detailed attention. Maybe we can explore further this hidden art deep in our soul, if it's related or can be related with emptiness in Nishitani. In any case, what I would like to say, just to as a final comment, is that I agree that there is this continuity with nature, both in the same in Miki and in Nishitani, that perhaps is not in Kant, and it can be a further development of Post-Kantian imagination, a sort of immanent transcendence or transcendence. And also, I would place Nishitani in these post-Kantian productive imagination theories of symbolic reason, because he's clearly attributing a noetic value to image, but also this aspect of searching, of meaning, of producing meanings that I understood in Miki is also present, perhaps in a more social sense, is also that is something that Nishitani is concerned. Maybe a point of contact between Miki and Nishitani is also myth, no? The importance they give to myths, the sense that he says that in the past there were other ways of grasping meaning of things, like in myths. So there was not this privilege of logocentrism or logos. And according to Nishitani, the modern philosophy is incapable of doing this because of the mythologization process, the logicization, and so on so far. So this idea that recovering the potential of myths, because mythical language can express this other dimension that conceptual or logos cannot, is something that perhaps both thinkers have in common and are indebted with this Kantian opening the door of the Kant opening the door for these symbolic forms, no? Symbolic processes. Well, thank you.
Yeah. I agree with you. I didn't really talk about myth, but myth was he in the Logic of Imagination, the first chapter was dedicated to myth, and myth is one of the media of forms, and it itself is a form for Miki. So Miki certainly saw the importance of myth. Also, I should just mention that logos, we were talking about logos, and londi is not exactly the same as logos. I think when Miki is talking about londi, the logic of imagination, kosoryoku no londi, the word logic there, londi, refers to this, I think, for Miki, refers to the structure or the process of the transformation of forms. So I don't think for him, it's necessarily equated with when he talks about logos as the opposite of pathos. Londi might be something that's encompasses both in the process of the transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay,
so
thank you.
for these really rich exchanges. And maybe we shall move on to see if the audiences also have their questions or comments to share. If you have any questions you want to ask, please raise your hand and we can talk about it. So I see Dennis Maras have a question. I think you're also muted. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. So yeah, let's say a warmly hello from Slovenia. It was really enjoying to participate in this discussion. So I have maybe a question or yeah, let's say a question or comment on the role or the function. Maybe the role is more appropriate of the word for it. The role of pleasure in the creative imagination. I'm really interested in this topic. I'm currently writing a dissertation on the connection between forming a collective subjectivity and the role of imagination in this process. And when you were mentioning, I think Raquel, you were mentioning the role of pleasure. If I have maybe too much too much notes, but one of you mentioned the role of pleasure, and I was interested. Maybe if you can, yeah. Oh no, Jody,
Maybe
you were
it was
mentioning.
Jody, yes.
Yeah, I just found, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for being a little bit dispersed. So yeah, can you? I don't know. I would really appreciate maybe some kind of. Can you introduce me to some texts where I can read more about it, or what would be your suggestions to open the field to understanding? And what's your I don't know, view on this connection? And again, yeah, thank you for really in-depth
Yes.
explanation.
Yes, I'm unmuted. You can't talks about pleasure and displeasure, if you're interested in displeasure as well, in his third critique, so the critique of judgment. And yeah, and as I said, there's sort of two levels operating in that. As I mentioned, that you're having this feeling of pleasure just with cognizing an object, but not actually knowing, not conceptualizing what it is. But then you can also reflect on that pleasure, and that he links that to judgments of the beautiful and the sublime. So most of that's probably a good starting point if that's what you're interested in. And then I think he also talks about in his anthropology, talks about pleasure as well. So you could have a look at his anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. Yeah.
Thank you.
That
I really
helps.
appreciate it. Yeah, it helps a lot, in fact, because it's I found it as really an interesting connection between those, because sometimes the question always arises, is there something more that drives the capacity of imagining itself. So can we like use, if it's not like I would say, what if imagination is the capacity that works on itself without an object that needs to be tied to, and what then is the drive that sustains this imagining process? So I'm not sure if I was clear, but it's something that sometimes I say irritates my my mind, in the sense that I'm again and again returning to it.
Yeah, I mean the schematizing activity of the imagination in the third critique is probably the most exciting, because it's in the imagination's in a free play. It's not ruled by concepts. So yeah, it's much more freer in its action, and that's when Kant links it with the work of the genius. So it can create, new forms. And these forms are forming for collectives because they provide a new model through which people can imitate. And so it's much more freedom and much more exciting in the third critique than the role that he ascribes in the first critique. But of course, they're both linked. It's more an objective role in the first critique, whereas the third critique is this sort of subjective schematism, but it's much more powerful.
Thank you.
That's okay. Actually, I had a question for Raquel. Did Nishitani write directly, refer directly to Kant? Because in your article you spoke mainly of, in reference to Plato. But yeah, did he talk about Kant?
Well, indeed, is precisely what I was saying at the beginning. I didn't pay much attention to Kant in my article. I was more focused on the tradition and the way Nishitani relates with Greek, Christian, and Buddhist tradition. But of course, he mentions Kant not in the same detailed way as I understand in Miki. As far as I gather this from John's analysis. But yes, and not only Kant, but Heidegger and Heidegger on Kant and Bergson. So this is a work I should do later, later on. More detailed analysis. What is Kant? What is Heidegger? There are some articles, some later writings of Nishitani dealing with, for example, of the work of art in Heidegger that has not been translated. So there's a lot of material to study more in a more detailed way. I have focused more in the last writings with imagination and myth, and he mentions this affection, poetry, these topics. But Nishitani is not developing a logic of imagination as Miki, or is not systematically dealing with this topic. It's more references that are scattered in the later writings. So we should study more deeply the Kantian mention and influence across his complete works that are 26 volumes.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's what's interesting in looking at Miki and Nishitani together is that both were students of Nishida, so they were both influenced by Nishida, but both of them also studied in Germany and studied with Heidegger. And so there's both have influences from Heidegger, except that Miki studied with Heidegger in the early 20s. Nishitani, it was in the 30s, right? So he...
Yeah.
30s.
when
Yeah, so
Heidegger was teaching on nihilism.
mhm. So they were both with Heidegger at different stages in Heidegger's development of Heidegger's thinking. But so it's interesting to see how they both take Nishida's influence and Heidegger's influence in different ways, but also, both were familiar with Kant, and they all studied all the basics of Western German and French philosophies. So it's interesting to see them go in slightly different directions.
Yep. And now we have a question from Gen Namuangrak, and I think this is our last question. Gen, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm primarily work on historical sociology, so it's kind of my perspective to share and maybe a question to at John Campbell. I see in your article that you have mentioned that Miki have intensively studied Mars in his maybe 1920s, and actually in my recent month, I have read Marx in much more in light of new reading of Marx, which emphasize the capital as a maybe abstract category of social relation, and I tend to thinking that I wasn't sure. I don't sure. I didn't sure that if Mickey have a commentary on Marxist on Marx historical materialism as the maybe socio-historical epistemology or something like that. So I want to know if you have something along with that.
Sure. I'm not sure if I was able to understand everything. The sound was a little bit off and on, but he does, he did write a series of articles on Marx, mainly focusing on the earlier Marx, and he published these articles in the 1920s. So there was a period in the 20s when he was very much interested in Marx, and then he put all the articles together in a book, which is only in Japanese. It hasn't been translated yet, but it's interesting to look at these writings on Marx. And he was also involved with he was associated with the Japanese Communist Party at that time, but then the Communist Party got banned, but also at the same time he was excommunicated by the Communist Party because he had an unorthodox interpretation of Marx, which the party members didn't like, so they also kicked him out. So he had an interesting relation with Marx, and there are traces of what he's saying in the logic of imagination. You can find traces of it in his earlier Marx writings, like how he understands the concept of ideology in Marx as a form of as a kind of a logos that a kind of a stratified fixated logos that had lost its connection to the more dynamic the dynamism of what he called fundamental experience, which is on a more basic level. And then there's different forms of logos, including what he called anthropology, which is how human beings understand themselves. And then ideology is when that understanding becomes fixed and rigid. So there were 3 levels, 2 kinds of logos, and then this the fundamental experience. Later in logic of imagination, that becomes pathos and logos. Yeah, so it would be. I plan to. Hopefully, I can write something on that later. I want to look at the connection between his earlier Marx interpretation and the logic of imagination. So. I don't know if does that answer what you were asking, or?
Yeah, actually, I'm writing on an article on the connection between Marx and Kant to in primary on imagination.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of if Kant have if Kant conception of productive imagination emerge in Marx, what kind of role it will be played in Marxist epistemology or something like that. I'm kind of thinking or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in this question.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Yeah. Thank
All
you.
right. So yeah, thank you very much for all the speakers and the audiences. I think we have all enjoyed thoroughly this far-reaching discussion. And lastly, let me take the opportunity to share with you news about our next installment of the Meet the Authors event, which will be about. Let me share the screen first. Can you see the flyer? Can you all see the flyer? Am I sharing?
It's small.
Small.
Now it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh.
So so on 23rd or 24th of October, we will have our 3rd installment of the Meet the Authors webinar. The topic will be on Paul Ricoeur's lectures on imagination, Sean Emmerich, Saulis Ganoushis, and Josh Taylor in discussion. So we will have Saulis Ganoushis and Josh Taylor presenting their works on Ricoeur's imagination, particularly the newly published book on the lectures on imagination with us. And we will have Jean-Luc Amoret to share with us his thoughts about these articles. And needless to say, Josh Taylor and Jean-Luc Amoret are both the editor of Ricoeur's Imagination Lecture. So it's a great opportunity to meet the authors and important scholars in this field and discuss with them Ricoeur's understanding of the imagination. You can find this flyer and relevant information shortly in our Facebook and academia.edu or other social media page. So thank you very much for everyone and the speakers, John, Raquel, and Jody. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have had a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Until next
Yeah,
time.
good night.
Good night.
Everyone.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. See you.